program for graduate studies at Charles Darwin University. And I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. Welcome to this Touchstone session. This is a Touchstone Endings session. How do HDR supervisors and students know that they have finished their PhD? Now, how do we know when a student is actually finished? How do we know an ending when we come across one? And as I've always said, beginnings matter, but endings matter more. At the beginning of a PhD, everything is really exciting. A student is thrilled to be given a chance to work on a research project for 3 years. A supervisor is bubbling with excitement about the project. The world is a wonderful place, colleagues. But at the end of a PhD, a student wants to throw their computer out of the window, trash the photocopier. Emotionally, they're just angry. They're just frustrated, they're just fearful. And we see all the problematic emotions: anger, resentment, depression, hatred, self-hatred, fear, worry, anxiety, all the good stuff bubble up in this cauldron of completion. And students are stressed, and wow, supervisors are stressed. As I always say, the final 3 months are the worst moments of our lives. And as supervisors, of course, we have to have these repetitively worst moments over and over again. It's like sort of Groundhog Day in a meth lab. But a student has one nightmare of an ending. And of course, many of us have 10 of these nightmares of students completing every year. So of course, beginnings matter, but endings matter more. And endings are deep moments. They're pivots of our lives where one reality ends and another begins. And that's why I think a sizable minority of students really don't want to finish. You know, the thesis is ready to go and they're clinging on to this prior reality. They are, if you will, emotionally unable to submit the thesis. So how does a student know that they're at the end of a PhD? How does a supervisor know that a student is at the end of a PhD? And I'm going to be answering these questions in many ways for you, using a series of proxies, yes, focusing on reading and research, writing and drafting, but also contextual matters. Remember too that a student at the end of their thesis are not in the best place to make decisions, because by the end a student can't really read their own work properly, which is why I do 10 drafts to submission that we'll talk about in another Touchstone, but 10 drafts to submission to create order in this chaotic time. So if I can give some students or some staff some proxies to look for, then we all know when they are ready to submit and we'll all feel a bit calmer. So here are 5 proxies, points of discussion for you, points of thinking for you to consider. 1. A student has answered their research questions. Now this is pretty obvious. A student knows that they finished their thesis when they've answered their research questions. And also at that point, the student should be able to write a powerful conclusion, because that shows how the student has answered those questions. And that's why as early as possible, and I mean really early in the first year, we need students to develop those tight and clear research questions. They need to also have a sentence which reads, "My original contribution to knowledge is." And they need to answer that question. Put that in a sentence as early as possible. My original contribution to knowledge is. And they also must have a clearly bounded research project, so know where the thesis ends. A student knows they've finished when they can independently go through each research question and they can read their conclusion and they can see not only that they have answered the questions, but they know how they did so. And at that point, it's scaffolded into an original contribution to knowledge. When a student is there, that is their ending. So let's go to number 2. and that's about deadlines and money. 2, set a date for completion and keep it. This is particularly important for students on scholarship, and let me tell you why, and this may be a surprise. Now, fewer and fewer of our students are on scholarship around the world. About 1/3 of Australian students do a PhD on scholarship, and actually internationally that's a pretty high figure. I know a lot of our friends in the United Kingdom shake their head that we have so many scholarships for our students in Australia. But let me tell you what happens to those students on scholarship, and let me tell you what happens just before I hit that narrative. So let me tell you what happened in my last job. I interviewed all the overtime students at the university, and unbelievably, and it certainly surprised me, they were dominated by students that were formerly on a scholarship. So the students that the university and the taxpayers had supported financially, they were the ones that were overtime. The people that self-funded had finished. Now, I know this seems seriously counterintuitive, but let me tell you why it happens. So, a student enrolls in a PhD with a scholarship. And what happens? I'll give you the narrative. They don't complete as much work as required in the first year. That delay cascades, and at 3 years, perhaps with an extension of 3 years, 6 months, they still haven't finished. What happens then? They switch to part-time. The money from the scholarship stops, they're scratching about for money, and they're used to focusing on the thesis full-time, and they're used to being paid to do that. The stress of that change creates mental health issues, and they end up in counselling. The problems continue. They click over the 4 years of enrolment, and they're now officially overtime. And then they panic that they do not have the capacity to finish. So this is the pattern. This is the narrative. So what has happened here is they didn't really have an actual due date in their minds. And the scholarship made them satisfied and perhaps complacent. They had money, it was cool, and all of a sudden the money stopped. It wasn't cool, and a mess resulted. So the reason we have annual reviews of progress, and particularly a confirmation of candidature, is so that students can plan. They can backwardly map, they can have a considered plan to get them to the due date, and they can stick to that plan. If a student doesn't have a date, and they don't have clear milestones delivered on time, then they don't backwardly map, and they drift. So for a student who has the privilege of being on a scholarship, their submission date has been given to them, and that date is when their scholarship ends. That is the student's date, and they must have finished by that date and plan and succeed in getting to that due date, because if the students don't get there, I have seen and studied the narrative of what happens to that group, and trust me, it is not pretty. So we have to make sure that if a student has the privilege of being on scholarship, then the end date of that scholarship is the date of their completion. We have to stick to it. There must be no excuses. So a submission date is the scholarship ending date. Name it at the start, work hard to reach that goal, submit on that date. And if a student doesn't, then their mental health, their lack of money will cascade chaotically past that date. So we need to remember, in my previous place of employment, the students on scholarship dominate the overtime students. That means the students with support became complacent, didn't have the pressure of a deadline, and bad stuff happened when their money ran out. Now, we all know a PhD is not about money, it's about research. But if a student wants their research and their money to align, then we require a precise deadline when they will submit. 3, reading and research. This is a powerful one. How do we know if our students have read enough? Really big question. And therefore, how do we know when students can stop reading? For me, there are two characteristics. A student starts to read the same authors over and over again, the same tropes, the same ideas, a second and then a third time. So by the time a student does the sweep and is confronting the same issues for a third time, then a student is done, because a student then knows the field. And if a student is reading and is still being surprised, they need to keep going. That's the important one for me. If they keep reading and they're continuing to learn a great deal that is new, then they must keep going. They haven't read enough. But there's one more tip here. Do a final Google Scholar search of the student's field on the research produced just before they submit. So in the 3 months before they submit, I do get my students to do that final Google Scholar check and pick up about 10, 15 new references. And that proves, of course, that the student knows the field, that a student has done the Google Scholar searches for the actual year that the thesis is being submitted. So this means that this thesis is modern and emerging research that is peppered throughout the thesis. So a student's research has shape and texture and form and a strong frame, including key research and just that sprinkle of brand new research produced in a couple of months before submission. That's enough. A student's finished. 4, writing and drafting. There is no such thing as a perfect sentence. There's no such thing as a perfect paragraph. There's no such thing as a perfect PhD. But a student's thesis must be solidly written. So it must be focused on the strong communication of their ideas. So we need to ensure, and this is the crucial bit, that the student's structure is effective, that the chapters are logical, rational, and work together, and the transition between a student's chapters, that's strong. A student's abstract must be sharp and clear, and a student's introduction must set the scene and confirm an original contribution to knowledge. A student's conclusion conveys the arc of their research. So we must not ever submit a thesis with spelling or grammatical errors, because the student will be punished. And those reports, bless those examiners, but the reports will list every single error that a student has made. So what I do, and I beg my students to do, is put a spelling checker through that very last draft and make sure that the sentences are grammatically correct. A student's paragraphing ensures the development of an argument. And look, that's all that's required. We need to aim for consistency in students' writing. And when a student has reached that stage, it is time to submit. No one's expecting or wanting Austen or Shakespeare or E. Cummings or even Tolkien. It is a PhD. Solid, consistent, grammatically correct writing, and that the writing signposts the student's argument. When students have that, they are ready to submit. The challenge, I think, emerges through drafting when students become emotionally attached to the thesis, and that's why I use my magical 10 draft model. It's not a magic number, but the reason I selected 10 is it places a template over the emotional moment in our students' lives. So we're not dealing with the emotions, we are going through the drafts. When we've done the 10th draft, we let it go. So if a student is feeling emotionally distressed about writing and drafting, put a thesis and the student's thesis through those 10 drafts and submit it when it's done. And what that does is it takes the emotion out of student writing and editing, and it treats the words, if you will, as if they were written by somebody else. The final advice I'd offer in this touchstone is about how to know when we're finished. Now, this stuff isn't quantitative, it's not clear, it's not a tip or a trick. It's about a student's intellectual landscape. How do we know that they've now finished? And that's 5. Has a student today occupied the edge of their knowledge, experience, and expertise when they've constructed this thesis. I know we all want metrics, we all want measurements to determine when a student is ready, in terms of writing and structure and research. And look, we can probably do that pretty easily in terms of research design and research questions. But in terms of scholarship, what's going on here? Well, a student has to have the main names and scholars in the field. They have to understand the shape of the debates in their field, and a student has to have the research material there, primary, secondary, non-reactive data sets. And those data sets have to demonstrate that the student has scope and scale. But this final tip is about the edges of a student's expertise. This not only happens, by the way, in higher degrees, but also in scholarly monographs as well. Because knowledge never finishes, research never finishes, learning never finishes. But research projects do. Nothing is ever perfect, nothing is ever a masterpiece. But a student needs to find a way to be satisfied, not in the perfection, but in the quality of this piece of work at this time. So what I do is I take a moment with my students, like a sort of intellectual stock-taking moment at the end of a project. And every project, of course, could produce 10 other tentacles, 10 other sub-themes or further areas and ideas and chapters, but there needs to be a stop. There really does need to be an end. Now, I do this by asking myself and my students one question. Is this the best I can do now? Have I operated at the extremities of my expertise now? Is this the best thinking that I can do today? Those questions exist for a reason. They allow me to forgive myself for any omissions that I might see in my work in the future. I give myself the space to grow and improve in the next project, but also I congratulate myself, and I ensure my students congratulate themselves, that this work is the best I can produce at this point of my life. I often describe doctoral theses and scholarly monographs, by the way, as intellectual photographs. They capture our intellectual development at a particular point. The moment after that photograph is taken, we change. That's normal, that's right. So recognise that this PhD is a student's best thinking at this point. And a student will move and will change and will transform and will improve from this point. The PhD is a student's photograph of this research moment. So take the photograph, acknowledge it, and move on to the next thing. And that's how we get a student finished, with rigour, with clarity, but also with some peace. And therefore it seemed pretty appropriate to conclude our Touchstone today with a model, with a mirror, and with an inspiration for endings and how we recognise them. It comes from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. As many of you may know, I tend to read Henry David Thoreau's Walden at least once a year, often around New Year's Eve. I find it sort of like a palate cleansing for my brain. But at particular moments of transition in my life, I read Eliot's Four Quartets. And there's one phrase that basically has kept me alive in the tough times, but also allows me to recognise and make peace with beginnings and endings. And that statement is, quote, "What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from." End of quote. A PhD is great, it's a fine achievement, but it is one achievement in what will be a lifetime of achievements. Therefore, we as supervisors must be understanding of the ending and create that really careful pathway to that ending that reduces stress on our students, because we show that every ending is also a beginning. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to Touchstones, our professional development program for graduate studies at Charles Darwin University.